It is with great pride that I introduce our next two speakers. They are alumni of Utah Valley University who are going on and doing great things. Kevin Glenn and Paul McCormick. Kevin is currently a therapist at a residential treatment center in Arizona. In fact, they're scattered throughout various parts of the United States, and who has a great deal of experience working with very difficult clients in very difficult settings. So his research includes many issues that touch on the philosophies of ontological hermeneutics, or a better way to put this is his application of Heideggerian and Gadamerhian concepts to various processes and practices in the field of psychotherapy. So without any further ado, gentlemen.
Thank you. Can you guys hear me if I talk loud enough? Okay, yeah. Okay. Yeah, exactly. I have the same problem that Nicole has. I cannot sit still in my presentations, and that's just the way it's going to be. It's always has been, always will be. I don't take any moral responsibility for it, and I never will. All right. Really quickly, before we get started, I want to show you guys something here. This came in through my email yesterday morning, just as we were kicking off the conference. An email letting me know that this website was up for Counselor Awareness Month. And I'm thinking, yeah, great, we have it every April. No big deal, right? Except this time, they talked about something a little bit different that I found very applicable to what we wanted to talk about in our presentation today. They said, this is our time of the year to let the world know how much counselors care. It's very interesting. In fact, they even have a link where we can follow their broadcasts. And I don't know if you can see it right here or not, but it's basically hashtag counselors care. Well, we're going to talk a little bit why in a minute of why this is of such interest. Today's agenda, I'm going to share a case study of a colleague of mine back in who wanted to be here, but her name is Michelle, and she was working with a client who we will be calling Wyoming, for no reason really. We're going to address countertransference, and we'll define what that is in a moment. We're also going to be going over mainstream counseling approaches because we want to juxtapose those with the radical relationality approach found in ontological hermeneutics. And I think it's important to understand the difference and the subtle nuances between the two. We also want to talk about the implications for therapist responsibility. All right, so the story of Wyoming. This story goes back to July of last year. Maybe it was, I think it was June. Michelle and myself and the other clinicians were sitting in a group supervision meeting with our supervisor, who has been in the field for a long time. He's a licensed professional counselor. He has a PhD in counselor education. He's a very brilliant man, very personal friend of mine. However, she was talking about her case with Wyoming, and she was very concerned because Wyoming was extremely suicidal. Not only was she suicidal, but she engaged in very serious non-suicidal self-injurious behaviors. What we mean by that in counseling is non-suicidal self-injurious behaviors are those which you harm yourself or you mutilate yourself without the intent to kill yourself. You just want the pain. Now, that doesn't mean that NSSIs don't sometimes end up in accidental suicides. They cut too deep, get the wrong vein, don't realize where they're cutting is where they shouldn't be cutting. Tragedies happen. So, however, Wyoming's case was a little more serious because she did have the intent to kill herself. In fact, that was her primary reason for admission to our residential treatment center. As she is staffing the case with our supervisor, she says, I'm very concerned, I really care about this client of mine, and I'm afraid that if we do not have enough adequate supervision on the dorm, she's going to complete suicide. Now, our supervisor cuts her off, dead sentence, and says, "Michelle, what are you doing right now? What are you doing? What are you doing?" And Michelle looks confused, and he says to her, "Are you engaging in countertransference right now?" Michelle, who was at her computer, looking at him like this, as soon as he asked that question, immediately did this. And that was it. There's a part where I get involved in this story, but it's not relevant to the conference, so we'll just move on from there.
Considering how we look at countertransference on the day-to-day as therapists, it's really not surprising that the supervisor had the reaction that he did. Usually when we talk about countertransference, we're talking about the subjective responses, emotions, and unconscious feelings between the clinician and client, and it's usually seen as something negative, something that shouldn't be happening. The issue with using the operating definition, though, is that means that all emotions that client and clinician feel are bad. So that includes empathy, concern, compassion. The actual definition, though, is an emotional entanglement, meaning that if Michelle had been going home every night crying herself to sleep about how much she feared for the life of her client, then yeah, this would be emotional entanglement. This would be countertransference. But that's not what was happening. Michelle just had a human response that there was another human being who was in pain, and she cared for that other human being. The issue, though, is that most mainstream approaches don't explicitly permit these feelings. So they don't explicitly say that it's okay for Michelle to feel compassion for her client.
As Paul was saying, this is precisely why I wanted to show that website before we got started just now. On the one hand, you've got this very dogmatic misconception, albeit dogmatic, it is a misconception on what countertransference is. It's a big no-no. You don't have it. You lose your objectivity. You become ineffective. It's harmful to the client. But then they want to devote an entire month of counselor awareness to how much we care. Now, what's interesting, though, is it's not just so much mainstream ethics or underlying assumptions in the field of psychotherapy itself. Many of the theories that we utilize promote and perpetuate this exact same paradigm. But they do it with subtle nuances. And we're going to break down some of the more popular ones to kind of demonstrate how they do this. Raise your hand if you're familiar with cognitive behavioral therapy or rational emotive behavioral therapy by Albert Ellis. Yeah, okay, so there you go, okay? The problem is, their entire premise is that you must maintain an objectivity to identify and reframe cognitive distortions. Cognitive distortions are systematic errors in thought, what we might call irrational conclusions. Who has the authority to determine this is a question for debate, but that's a topic for another conference. The problem with this, though, is that when you're sitting there listening to the client talk with only the intent of identifying an error in their thinking so that you can quickly intervene, like, what did you just say? What might be a way that you can reframe that thought? There's no care. There's no compassion here. It's not there. Now, I actually want to share really quickly a situation that I was faced with around the same time as of what happened with Michelle in our supervision. I was working with a client who we're going to call Avery, and she was probably my most difficult client to date. She ended up eloping from the facility before any therapy could get done. Every time she'd come in, it was, "I hate you, Mr. Kevin. You can die, burn in hell." Every single day. Just boom, 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 boom. One day, though, she came in distressed and actually wanted to talk about something. She wanted to talk about how much she was being bullied by the other classmates on in the day school program that we have on site. And I started asking her questions like, "Well, what are they saying?" "I don't know, they're just bullying me." "What are they doing?" "I don't know, they're just bullying me." I'm looking at, okay, all right. So after our session was over, I went and talked to the teacher, and the teacher said, Avery just sits in the back of the corner doing nothing. No one's talking to her. So my first thought might be, yeah, we've got some cognitive distortions here, right? And being against CBT, I was actually surprised that I somewhat found myself going there and having to resist that urge. I even staffed this case in a clinical supervision meeting where my colleagues believed it was cognitive distortions. However, I refused to capitulate. The theory that I subscribe to says if it's real to the client, it's real to me. So I just operated under the assumption that it was real, and we worked from there. This was one of the rare times we were actually doing some therapy. After she eloped from the facility, a little binder, the sketch pad, was retrieved. And some of the staff members were going through it just to see if there were any other plans for elopement attempts from the other students that may have conspired with her. There was nothing, but what they did find they wanted me to see, so I read through it. I found over 40 notes that were passed to her by her peers where they were bullying her. And it was some pretty sick stuff. So I was grateful that I had that compassion, that I was willing to let it be real to me. If I tried to challenge that, I might have shut her down. Anyway, it's just one anecdotal story there. How many of you are familiar with dialectical behavior therapy? It's basically skills training. You come to me, you tell me what your problem is, and we're going to give you skills. An example is opposite action. You want to hit the wall, it's an unhealthy urge, you do the opposite and walk away. Okay? The issue with this, though, is it's very similar to cognitive behavioral therapy. You're not listening with the intent to understand and have compassion and empathize. Or if you are, it's only to get your client to buy into whatever program you're about to share with them. Instead, the intent is, you tell me what the problem is, I will agree with you that it's a very serious problem, and I'll just give you a skill, you go on your way, and if it doesn't work, well, it's on you. And that's really how it is. DBT is taught in a way that the skills always work. There's a scent of hubris in there. The skills always work because you're the one that makes them work. So if you come back saying, it didn't work for me, there's going to be no compassion. There's going to be no care there. It's going to be, oh, no, let me correct that. The skill worked. You just didn't make it work. Is everyone with me so far? Okay. Now, I'm going to blow through the next two real quickly. Solution focus. Oh, by the way, got a lot of DBT. And she was met with very similar interventions when she tried to talk about how they weren't working for her. As a group therapist, all of the clinicians that go, or all the clients that go through the individual clinicians, they also filter through my groups. So I hear a lot about them processing about what their therapies are like. Now, solution-focused therapy is essentially, it's a popular one because it's fast. It's sit down, I don't really want to talk about how you're feeling, what you're going through, and some people actually really like that. I mean, let's just face it, there are people in this world who don't want to sit around and talk about their feelings. I get that. They just, here's my problem, I want a solution. And this works for them. The issue becomes when therapists stick to it universally across the board, because then you get those clients coming in who do want to be heard. But the focus is on the solution, not on empathizing and caring and having compassion for the client. Raise your hand if you're familiar with eclecticism. Okay, eclecticism is essentially the idea of we've got all these therapies, we don't know which one works the best, which one is right, which one's wrong, so we're just going to mix and mash them all into one gigantic hodgepodge. The problem with that is there's absolutely no theory driving what you're doing. You have all these interventions that tell you how to intervene, but you got no theory telling you when you should intervene. Are you guys with me on that? So you're essentially saying, I know what to do, but I don't know why I'm doing it, I don't know how to do it. So you're left without the instruction manual, essentially.
So the question that we ask is, if clients aren't feeling heard, if they're not feeling like their therapist really cares for them, then why would they share their deepest, darkest, most feelings? And the answer is that in a lot of cases they don't. Kevin and I know a lot of people personally who have told us this, but we also found a forum online that has these two examples of people who don't feel safe telling their therapist everything. The first one here is by Flawed Plan, and this is about reframing cognitive distortions. I'll go ahead and read it, even though I know you're not supposed to, but we are. It says, doing CBT is doing violence to my mind. The one thing I swore over and over when I was being raped and beaten over and over was that I would never allow violence into my mind. They had my body, but I would never, ever let aggression into my mind. No wonder I hate this therapy. The second one is about DBT, the skills-based one, where really the skills are used to pacify, not really to heal. And she says, DBT has taught me to suffer in silence, because if it gets to be too much, if the pain bleeds out, if I exhibit behavior that is unacceptable to my therapist and others, then I may be labeled as a volatile client who is difficult to handle and told that DBT is my last resort. What we're seeing here, and what Kevin and I have seen in conversations with other people, is that oftentimes because people feel like they're not being heard, they feel like they can't have safe conversations with their therapist. Instead, they feel like they're being attacked, as Kevin pointed to while talking about the mainstream therapies. So what's causing this? I mean, Kevin already went over a little bit, but something that we do want to focus on, or I do want to say, is that we don't blame the therapists. We don't believe therapists are sitting in their office and drumming their fingers together and cackling to themselves about how much they want to hurt their client. But what we're finding is that many of the therapies that they're using are so mechanized that oftentimes it makes it so that their clients don't really feel like people, don't really feel like they're being heard. And then on top of that, they don't really feel like they have any freedom as to how their therapy is going. That this is my therapist and he gives me the program and I have to take the program because that's the only option. Why is this a problem? Well, a lot of it's because we're not physicians. You know, people don't come in and say, I hurt here, here, and here, and expect interventions to make them no longer hurt in those places. What we see are people who come in and they explain what their life is like. They explain some of the deepest things that they maybe have never shared with anybody else, and in that, their identity begins to emerge. Well, you can imagine that if you were sharing something that important to you and your identity was emerging, maybe the first time you'd ever let it emerge in front of anybody, and immediately somebody cuts in with, oh, well, you know, you're thinking about that wrong. Here's an intervention. Let me tell you how to fix that. Well, a lot of times people don't feel like the problem is being fixed. They feel like the therapist is saying you need to be fixed. Which, again, leads to the idea of unsafe conversations, right? Because they feel like they can't share everything, because every time they try to share everything, they get attacked. And really, it's this emerging of identity that we really want to focus on for the rest of the presentation, because that's really where we look at things from.
All right. If I say self-concept, raise your hand if you know what I mean by that. Okay, your self-concept is the thoughts, the views that you have of yourself. This is what we mean by identity emerging in the conversation. Who the client actually is always ultimately emerges in every psychotherapeutic dialogue. Even if it's not direct, the things that they're talking about still give you clues. For example, I might ask the client, what were you doing when you started having your panic attack? I was playing Call of Duty. Okay, well, I now just learned he likes video games, so I know a little bit about him now, a little bit more about him now. So that's an example. The issue is that mainstream psychotherapy is not focused on the identity of the person. They're operating from a risk needs assessment model where they are looking only at symptomatology. What is the client experiencing? What are they going through? How can we fix this? How can we intervene? And this is part of the reason why when aspects of who the client is emerges, they're just glazed over through mainstream therapies. When I do co-therapy and when I work with other clinicians, I see them do this. But I also know every conversation I've had with them for the past 2.5 years, where they talk about how much they care about the clients. So there's a dichotomy here, there's a paradox. Counselors who care, but they're limited to therapies that don't permit them to care. Now, we want to focus on some aspects of identity that are emerging. We're going to be drawing from some continental philosophy of the 20th century. A man named Charles Taylor, a Canadian philosopher. He talks about moral visions. Moral visions are essentially our ideas of the good life. What is admirable in life? What's valuable to us? What is worth pursuing? These are what we call moral visions. Now, we are not talking about the morals that get you into heaven. We're talking about the morals that you personally value in your life, what you esteem to be worthwhile. If a video game is your number one hobby, that's a moral vision for you. It is worthwhile for you to do. Strong evaluations, these are the aims and the goals that we deem as valuable and worthy of pursuit as well. Moral visions are composed of strong evaluations. It also works the other way around. Think of it like this. You've got a set of goals that you are going for. And maybe those goals have an ultimate goal of getting a doctorate degree in philosophy. Your moral vision is education, to do something with your life. The strong evaluation is, I must go to school to achieve that vision of mine. Now, the reason why they're called strong evaluations is because they're your evaluations. No one else makes them for you. If they did, they'd be weak evaluations. There's no therapy that I'm aware of that addresses these values this way. Instead, they talk about needs. What are your needs? Well, I want to go to school. Okay, that's a need. And then that's put into a mathematical formula to contrast against risk. There's no compassion there. It's being mechanized. Our identities are also largely informed by our relationships with others. What Charles Taylor refers to as the dialogical self. Dialogical meaning conversations. Who we are is a composite of every conversation we've ever had in our life. In psychotherapy, though, that's not what we're looking at. The only location and the only constituent of identity in psychotherapy is in your mind. What we might call solipsism. But the thing is, these issues that we're talking about here that emerge in identity, as Paul was just alluding to, they are highly ethical, sensitive, and vulnerable aspects of our lives. And they are revealed in therapy to the therapist. This is why we are arguing for a moral responsibility of therapists to fully and correctly understand what countertransference is and is not, and to actually care about their clients, to have that compassion. Now, Paul is right, though. If you're going home and crying every night because your client might kill themselves, well, okay, now you're getting into the countertransference that Freud initially talked about, and you're not doing anyone any good at that moment. So there is a balance to be drawn there.
All right, so how do we facilitate this arising of the self in therapy? Kevin and I subscribe to something as Matt pointed out as well, which is hermeneutic philosophy. And what hermeneutics does is it sets out to determine what it means to be human and what it means to have experiences. From this tradition, we've gleaned four tenets to be followed to help facilitate the self coming out more fully in therapy. And those four are ditsaka, or subject matter, infinity and unfinalized, fusing of horizons, and authenticity.
Okay. Ditsaka is German for the matter of the subject. We want to focus on the subject matter in therapy. Most mainstream therapies are not looking for the subject matter. They're looking for the erroneous thought that needs to be corrected, and they're looking for the impulse that will have a matching skill to correct. They're not concerned with the subject matter. What Ditsaka would permit a therapist to be able to do is to have a theory, a tenet that says, I know that as this person's talking to me, I'm going to hear needs, I'm going to hear risks, I'm going to hear symptoms, but the matter of the subject is who the client actually is. It's a way of refocusing the therapist on what it is that he or she is trying to work with and intervene on. All matters of psychotherapy dialogue ultimately come down to matters of the self. Gadamer even talks about understanding and says that all understanding is self-understanding. We're not capable of understanding things from a nominal perspective as Kant might talk about. Instead, we only understand things from a phenomenal perspective of what it means to us. We want counselors to be able to go into the therapy room with the mindset of knowing that they're going to be working with highly sensitive issues that are very valuable and personal to the client, and we must remain focused on it. The client is sitting there talking about who they are. We don't give a skill that says you use this in place of what you're doing, because as Paul said, what the client hears is who I am needs a skill. Who I am needs fixing. Does anyone have any questions at this point? All right. Oh yeah, by all means.
How does going back to self-concept then relate to the client's context, the other people in the client's life?
Do you mean in the therapy room or from the theory that we're advocating for?
As a therapist, view the client as a self, but then is it necessary then for them all, the therapist also to recognize that person is in relation to many other people?
Yes, absolutely. I'll give you, actually, there's several reasons why, but in the interest of time, I'll just give you one big important one. Because those conversations have influenced the client the way that he or she is, then I must humble myself and accept the fact that whatever advice or intervention I have to give will conflict with what that client has been brought up and enculturated with, and accept that they can reject what I have to say and that that's not resistance to therapy. Okay.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you're recommending like throwing out the kinds of therapies you consider at the beginning, or more complementing them, which just kind of focus on the whole self and more compassion.
That is an excellent question. That ultimately would come down to the therapist and what theory they subscribe to. Our personal intent, though, is not to throw them out. We do not want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. If a person continues to do something because of something that they are legitimately thinking in their mind, and we expose them to what cognitive distortions are and how to reframe them, they go back and try that for a week and come back and say, that's the first time in 3 years I've gone 7 days without self-harming. Let's go with it. So then that means that what we're hoping for is that instead of reframing cognitive distortions from the theory that CBT uses, you would be, let's say that you did want to use something from hermeneutics or even Gestalt or existentialism, then what we're hoping is that you will use those interventions from these other therapies with a different theory other than CBT in the backdrop guiding it. Do I need to explain that differently, or?
No, that's fine. I think I'll get more.
Yeah, okay. Essentially what we're trying to say is that there's no reason to throw away the mainstream therapies. We are hoping to complement and even synthesize if we can. That would be ideal. Okay. Now, this comes back to your question again a little bit slightly. When we're talking about who the client is, there's a couple of concepts that we want to remember. Mainstream psychology and psychotherapy subscribes rather implicitly to a hidden assumption that who the person is ultimately unchangeable. Who they are at 24 years of age is the exact same person they will be when they're 70. Kind of contradictory to the idea of, well, then why do we even do interventions in the first place, right? Yeah. So we have two philosophers here that we feel can help with this. Emmanuel Levinas is one of them. Emmanuel Levinas very simply just says that when we assume a client cannot change or even limit the number of possibilities presented to them for change, we have essentially totalized them. We've, to use biblical terms, we've damned their progression, essentially. What we're hoping, though, is that Levinas's answer can be something that psychotherapists can use in their practice. When the therapist remains open to infinite possibilities of not only change, but who the client can be, then we're hoping that we can increase the potential not only for change to occur and for the client to actually grow, but we're also hoping that what can happen is the client will begin to feel more care and compassion. Essentially what we're trying to do is we're trying to show the client care and compassion without saying, hey, you're paying me to be my best friend. Or to be your best friend, I mean. Does anyone have any questions so far? Or are you guys with me on that? Okay. Now, Bakhtin offers something very similar that helps us remember the spirit of the client, to use his word. We're not talking about this metaphysical being that ascends to another metaphysical place upon death. But the spirit of the client, meaning who the client really actually is, the humanity of the client. And he talks about a term that he uses called unfinalized, where we remember that the client is constantly changing and growing, and counselors are always learning who the client is. Our mainstream therapies, again, it's not the counselors doing it, but our mainstream therapies have a tendency to habituate us into thinking that we know who the client is at all times. But we really don't. In fact, more than likely, the window that we're seeing into the client's life is exponentially smaller than what our mainstream therapies would have us believe. So, if I sit here and I assume I know who the client is, but I'm still remaining open to infinite possibilities of change, I've still finalized him. The difference is this. With totality, I've limited the options, or at least have decided to reject certain options that the client's presented to me about how we can change. But I want to be open to infinite possibilities. With unfinalized, I'm remembering that at every single moment I'm learning more about who the client is. That my knowledge of that client is never complete at any time.
So the third tenet is the fusing of horizons. This is given to us by Gadamer. And it starts out with a mindset where the therapist keeps their mind infinitely open. What that means is that we always allow what the client says to matter to us. If it's real to the client, it's real to the therapist. And if the experiences are meaningful to the client, they're meaningful to us. So what this means is that if I have a high school student who comes to me and I am his therapist, and he tells me about how he just broke up with his girlfriend and how distraught he is and how he feels like his life is just ending, Paul, as an adult, finds that kind of ridiculous. That, yeah, it's not, it's not a happy experience, but his world is not ending. But when I'm using fusing of horizons, what I need to do is I need to set my own mindset aside and realize that he isn't me. That he's seeing this from his own viewpoint, or we call it his own horizon. And so what I need to do is I need to make it so that this experience that he's having needs to be important to me just as it's important to him. And that what I'm going to try to facilitate is to, as best I can, as Kevin's been talking about, to understand it from his point of view as much as I possibly can. And then facilitate him listening to me and me listening to him, and the two of us coming together and seeing this problem from a fuller perspective, because we fused or brought our two horizons together. And what we're trying to do with this is we're trying to relate increased compassion, increased peace for our client. And what we're hoping is that a byproduct of this is that, again, going back to safe conversations, that my client will feel safer talking to me about his viewpoint, because he realizes that his viewpoint is actually important to me. That I'm not just trying to force my horizon on him, but I'm allowing the way that he sees it to be important to me. But what we don't want to do is we don't want to use fusing of horizons as a way to manipulate our clients. The fourth tenet that we glean from hermeneutics is authenticity, and that means that we need to be honest. It means that we are who we are in our environment, and that we take on the role that is appropriate for the relationships that we're in. And everybody's authenticity tends to look a little bit different. And that's a really easy concept for all of us to hypothesize about. That everybody's different, and we all see things differently, and everybody's life is different. But it becomes a little more difficult when we start putting it into real life situations. A really great example of this is in Remember the Titans. We all see in Remember the Titans. Oh, well, sorry. It's just a quick synopsis that won't ruin anything, I promise. It takes place during the time of segregation, where black students and white students are kind of forced to spend time together. And there's one black student named Petey and one white student named Sunshine, is what they call him. And they're outside of a restaurant, and Sunshine says, "Hey man, let's go inside this restaurant right here. Let's get something to eat." And Petey goes, "Sunshine, wait, I can't do that." And Sunshine goes, "No man, don't worry about it. I'll pay. Let's come inside. Let's go sit down and eat." And Petey goes, "Sunshine, you don't understand. I can't go in that restaurant." And finally, Sunshine convinces him to go in there. The guy who owns the restaurant is incredibly rude and kicks them out. And as they get kicked out, Petey gets really mad and says, "I told you, Sunshine, I told you that I can't go in there." Now, in this example, Sunshine is being entirely authentic. That for him, as a young white man, in the time of segregation, for him to go in that restaurant was totally fine. But Petey was also being authentic. In the time of segregation, as a young black man, he could not go into that restaurant. We see this in therapy as well. A great example that we use a lot is a gangbanger. That he comes in and he talks to us, and he tells us that he has to kill somebody to be a full-fledged member of the gang. And as therapists and people from our situation, that doesn't savvy. It's weird to think that to be your true self, to be authentic, it would mean that you need to kill somebody. What we need to remember is what Sunshine learned, is that his life looks different than my life. And we need to acknowledge that it is authentic for him to say that he needs to kill somebody to be a full-fledged member of the gang. Now, something that is also true is that acknowledgement does not mean condoning. We're not, so when we hear that, we don't say, "Oh, that's great. Yeah, go kill somebody. That seems like a good idea." Instead, what we do is we try to offer other ways for him to be authentic, other ways for him to relate to his surroundings, while still realizing that he is being authentic in what he's telling us. Another thing we need to look at when it comes to authenticity comes from another football movie, because apparently this is all that Kevin and I learned from, is The Blind Side. Hopefully we've all seen The Blind Side, and I'm sure some of you have not. I'm sorry about that. But it's about Michael Orr, well, loosely about Michael Orr, who turned out to be an NFL football player. And he started out in really humble beginnings in a really bad neighborhood. And as he was growing up, he gets taken in by an affluent family. And they kind of show him how they live. But what you'll find in the movie, and as I understand it in real life, is that it wasn't just going into that house that made him decide, "Oh yeah, I guess I'll change because someone's telling me to change." Instead, what happens is he goes back to his old neighborhoods and he sees his friends who got into gangs, got into drugs, got into violence, and he himself made the decision to change his life. What we're finding is that real change, the kind that we're looking for in therapy, has to be authentic. It has to come from the person, just like it had to come from Michael Orr. Nobody could push that on him. We're talking about strong evaluations. They're strong because they come from you. So the changes that we make have to be authentic. That's partially why we want to use fusing of horizons, so that we can bring the client in on the deciding what the intervention is, so that they can own it as well. And what we're hoping is through peace and compassion, that eventually the client will help us see their authentic self as much as it's possible for us to see it.
All right, we've just thrown a lot of philosophical jargon at you guys. Some of you may be more familiar with it than others. And I would imagine there are probably some aspiring clinicians in here who, you know, I get it. Philosophy is not your thing. I'm not knocking. I get that. So we have a 3-step intervention model that actually was started by Matthew Draper that we've all kind of been working on to flesh out since then. This model brings the 4 tenets of philosophy that we've been talking about into something that is very practical. The first one is focusing on the relationship with the client, what therapists refer to as rapport. The difference with hermeneutics, though, is that rapport is not used as a means to get the client to buy into your program. We call that motivational interviewing in psychotherapy. You align with the client, you build that rapport, and then once you've done that, you've now intrinsically motivated them to do what you want them to. We're not actually going to do that here. Instead, we focus on the compassion. We don't focus on getting to know you so that I may slap interventions on you. I'm getting to know you because I understand that my compassion as a therapist is where the true healing is going to come from. In all of the 35 or 40 years that we've been doing research on what is effective in therapy, we've gotten a plethora of contradictions of what works and what doesn't. There is only one that has remained constant all 30 years, or 40, depending on who's counting and what you consider to be research, that is effective all the time. And that is the relationship the client has with the therapist. So you can see where if you're manipulating that relationship to reframe cognitive distortions, you're effectively undoing the very thing, the very one thing that's been shown to be effective consistently. When I say you, I don't mean the people in this room, though. I'm sure you guys realize that, but I wanted to point it out anyway. Now, we also want to maintain an attitude of openness at all times. This, the fusion of horizons, authenticity. We understand that what the client says matters to me. If it's real to the client, it's real to me. If the client says, that's a really good way of looking at things, Kevin, it's not for me though, okay, we move on to the next thing. We keep talking. Our idea, our hope as therapists, which is what the third one is just building and creating new possibilities of being in the world for the client. Because that's ultimately where the healing is going to come from. As we model compassion, the client is going to emulate that model in the real world, strengthen their support system with family members and friends, and becoming an active member of their community in hopefully a pro-social way. And that's where the true healing will come from. And there are many thousands of possibilities for being in the world, as Levinas says, remaining open to infinite possibilities. It takes time, but it's worth it. Then you find the possibilities for change, the possibilities for being that the client feels are authentic to him. Not because the therapist says this will work.
So the implications for counseling are kind of threefold. So the first thing that what we're trying to do is we're trying to model peace and compassion. We're trying to relate to the client with peace and compassion to help them to feel like they're having safe conversations with us so we can look seriously at what's really going on in their life and meet those problems head on. Having them be a part of the solution. Then what we hope is they will take that, our modeling peace and compassion home. But then they will relate to people who are around them with peace and compassion themselves, strengthening the relationships around them, making it so the changes that we've helped bring about in their life maintain. They'll continue being there because they have learned to relate in a better way with the people around them. And then finally, our hope is that the people that they relate to will also relate with more peace and compassion to people around them. The overarching goal that we have is to build stronger communities, to make it so that it's not just the one client that we're helping, but we're helping them and the people around them and the people around them to build a stronger, happier world, I guess.
Now, as Matt alluded to and then Paul talked about as well, we're the actual theory that we are operating from, that guides everything we do, that we would hope that others would be sympathetic to, is a continental approach known as ontological hermeneutics. It's got roots way back in biblical times in the 1500s when it was used as a means for understanding what scripture and literary text meant. Over time, some continental philosophers from Europe in the 19th and 20th century have taken those concepts and have moved them into the human sciences. This conference is about moral responsibility. And we've heard a lot of talk about compatibilism, incompatibilism, determinism, free will. Does moral responsibility actually exist? Does it not exist? Hermeneutics has a fundamental assumption from the outset that that's the wrong way to look at it. We consider it dualistic. We view the whole dualism versus monism issue here. Instead of taking up this individual approach where the individual is some bounded, masterful self that is somehow above and against his world, he is an active member inside of it, and therefore he has agency, that his agency comes from his relationships with others. Now, this doesn't resolve some fundamental concerns that our determinist counterparts might have, which is the fact that we do not have 100% control over our environment. That there are aspects of reality and of who we are that actually constrain or limit our agency. From the hermeneutic perspective, we're not looking at determinism and free will. We're looking at possibility and constraint. The possibilities that I can choose from will always be limited by my surroundings around me. The most easy example to give you is this. If I wanted to come to this conference from Phoenix, Arizona, what possibility, just start throwing them out to me, guys. What possibilities did I have of getting here? Bus. Plane. Car. Well, I could have even walked all 653 miles if I wanted to. Yeah, I would have had to leave last month, but I could have done it. You know? Okay, what possibilities are not available to me? Spaceship, teleportation, wormholes, swimming. Yeah. I mean, we do have a lot of pools in Phoenix, but once I get out of Phoenix, I'm going to be up, I'm going to be in some problems here. So, now, did I ultimately have the choice to come here? This is the question that has, as my fellow philosophers here know, this battle has raged for the better part of 4,500 years now in philosophy. We know that. What hermeneutics is saying is that yes, the agency is there, but your possibilities for exercising that agency will always be constrained by relational factors, meaning I may want to take a very beautiful girl out to dinner, but if she says no, anyway, yeah. So they will always be constrained by environmental factors. In our system of universe right now, we don't have time travel. We have laws of physics. I can't fly of my own willpower. They'll also always be constrained by biological factors. We've heard a lot from our prior presenters about the neurology behind what's going on, the neuroscience. That there are actually chemicals and bundles of neurons in there that are inhibiting our capacities. They'll always be there, but it doesn't undermine our agency in the end. Now, at the same time, we have this hermeneutic approach that we've been applying to therapy, and the attempts to bring it to psychotherapy have been around for quite a while now. It even goes as far back as some of you psychologists, even philosophers may know William James, the pragmatist from the early 1900s. He was actually one of the first to bring it to psychotherapy, and it was from those efforts that existentialism was built off of. The application of hermeneutics to psychotherapy is what some of us have started to call relational and compassionate psychotherapy. Because what we're finding is I go to my friends who they don't even know what continental philosophy is, and I say, yeah, I do ontological hermeneutics. the first thing they want to know is what it is. The second thing they want to know is that ethical? Because I've never heard of it. You know? So we're trying to take some of the food out of the mouth when we're saying the name here. Now, to be specific, if I were to be asked, what is relational and compassionate psychotherapy? I would say it is a continuation of efforts to apply ontological hermeneutics to psychotherapy. That it can serve as a grounding theory in eclecticism. This goes back to Leah's question earlier. Are we trying to do away with CBT and DBT? No, we're hoping that you will do CBT and DBT from the theory of hermeneutics or a similar theory that you subscribe to, or even if it's on the way other side of the universe, but it works for you, use it. And let that be your grounding theory for how you intervene with the client. It is a specialized form of mutually respectful dialogue between therapists and clients concerning how to better understand and actualize the good life in our communities. If there are those of you who are in school to become therapists, and you find that some of these tenets have resonated with you and you're not quite sure where to begin, well, definitely email me or Paul or Matt. We can definitely point you in the right direction, but you could get started immediately with just the 3-step model. It will work with any therapy out there. It really will. There is a quote that I thought of when I first started working on this, and it's by Frank Richardson, Blaine Fowers, and Charles E. Young. It comes from their book, Re-envisioning Psychology. It says, "We are inescapably involved in expressing, challenging, strengthening, and shaping contemporary perspectives concerning what is worthy or admirable in human life. We must recognize that we are continually engaged in ethical activity that grows out of and shapes our current conceptions of the good life." And as Erdonast Volkan has explained, ethics involves choice. Choice involves agency. Where there is agency, moral responsibility must exist. Thank you. Do we have time for questions?
We have 5 minutes.
Okay. Go ahead.
I wanted to thank you for that. I thought that was really terrific and just inspiring, and captures, it makes explicit what I think what all good clinicians intuitively know, but they often don't have a kind of explicit theoretical framework that articulates what's going on in the interaction.
Exactly.
So I wanted to commend you for that.
Thank you.
I also wanted to offer the following thought. You know, I'm in psychiatry. I know you're counselors. In psychiatry, you often get a lot of eye rolls from people. There's a movement called the anti-psychiatry movement that says, you know, what psychiatry does is it comes up with labels and pathologizes and creates, in some of what you said, creates interventions that, who gives them the right to call something a problem, and who gives them the right to create these interventions? And I'm sympathetic to that view, but I also think this: the right to call something a problem and the right to have certain interventions comes from a very careful understanding of the person, the client, their ideals, what you call the moral visions, and their strong evaluations. Ultimately, the license comes from them.
Right.
And that's the way to diffuse a lot of skepticism about psychiatry, to recognize that there is prescriptions coming from psychiatry and counseling in any clinical field, but the ultimate license comes from the client themselves. Proper understanding comes from themselves. Right. And that's what I took away as part of what you guys were trying to convey.
Yeah. Absolutely. And thank you for that. We wholeheartedly agree. In one of the slides, you might have read the words conflict between freedom and commitment. When somebody else arbitrarily says, this is a problem and this is how you fix it, you've now constrained the freedom of the client because you've forced them to commit to your moral vision of what the good life is. And we know we shouldn't be doing that. We've got a moral responsibility not to rob another person of their agency or of other possibilities that may not be favorable to us. At the same time, though, I'm sympathetic to with what you're saying. Just because we don't have that authority doesn't mean we can't make suggestions.
Can you go back to I think it was when you were talking about authenticity.
Mm-hmm.
So the guy who came in and said, in order to be a member of the gang, you had to kill somebody. Right? And so, what you said there shocked me. And makes me want to not agree with the thing you just said, which was, we can make suggestions for what people should do. We shouldn't rob them of their vision of what they take to be good. There, you might think, the person's so mistaken about what it means to live.
Right.
So maybe just to talk more about what.
Yeah.
Maybe explain more what you mean when you say, well, you can't just go in and sort of offer a bunch of, I don't know, demand, like, no, you have to take this tool and this tool and this tool and fix your life right now.
Right.
Maybe just talk a little bit more about.
Absolutely. I'm actually very encouraged by your question, and I completely agree with you. That has happened to me quite a few times, actually, already. And understanding that that is authentic to the client does not mean I agree with it. At the same time, as much as I know that killing is wrong, and I have the authority to make that assessment in my life, and it happens to be a shared value by pretty much everyone in society, I do not have the authority to push that on the client. I can present possibilities for alternatives.
Or even point out why that line of thinking may lead to trouble later.
Right.
But we can't rob that from them.
It's very common for me to be told, I'm going to be in the gang because they provide me protection, family, and I'm not getting out of the gang. And I don't care what you have to say, Mr. Kevin. Okay, well then you accept the consequences that will arise from that decision. Go ahead, Matt. Oh, I'm sorry. Did that help you at all?
I'm following out with it.
Okay.
I'm a little concerned too. Aren't there times when we as therapists can be very forceful that this will not stand, you will not do this? We call the police when somebody's actively abusing a child, for example.
Yeah.
Can your theory account for that?
Yes, absolutely. Part of the dialogical self, what we referred to earlier, is the idea that your identity is formed by your conversations with others. Well, the fact that you're now in my office means that my conversation is going to have an influence. My voice is going to have an influence on who you are. Yes, I most definitely can say, that is wrong. You should not be doing that. Where the humility part comes in is that the therapist understands that that client can walk out of my office and make his own choice. He can do what he wants. Where the other humility part comes in is if the client says, you know what, I am with you. I do not want to kill people, but I don't know how else to get food on my table. I need to be a part of this gang so that I can get food, shelter, protection, family, all that. Okay, I'm with you on that. Let's talk about some possibilities of how you can get those needs met that don't involve killing people. Does that answer your question?
It does. That's pretty good time. Kevin, if the question is correct, we have time for you.
I'm just going to say from my viewpoint, from my own this is a no-brainer.
Right?
It's a no-brainer. But I'm wondering if you're experiencing a lot of resistance from your colleagues.
Okay, I feel... Go ahead.
Because when you said, and you said it several times, that your client feels like, or your client feels like he or she is being attacked, I mean, that sends chills down my spine.
Yeah, no, we are. Not only are we, when you say resistance, you mean from our colleagues, right? Yeah, it's not only resistance, it's vehement resistance. Very, very vehement resistance. All right. I mean, I've literally got a who would call all of this, because he has, I'm actually going to directly quote him, muckety-muck bullshit that does nothing but complicate this field way beyond what it was ever intended to be. Right, exactly. Who ended up being right for the most part all along.